Hello and welcome to this video about the quadratic formula. The goal/learning target of this video is to use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic equation. First, let's address what it is. The quadratic formula is a means of finding a solution or the solutions to a quadratic equation. And so what it is it's the answer to x equals something. And it's a pattern. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now you might be wondering, what do I mean by b squared, a, c, 2, 4, all that other stuff? That comes from the standard form of a quadratic equation. F of x is equal to ax squared plus bx plus c. These a, b's, and c's are what get plugged into the quadratic formula. And so that's what it is. Now let's address the question, what does it do? The quadratic formula is, the way I like to think of it, a fail-safe. You could use it to solve any and all quadratic equations. There are several other methods you can use. You can complete the square, which can be tricky at times. You can factor if it's factorable. You can graph it if you have that kind of technology available. But this is something you can always do. When is it useful? When factoring seems difficult. Or impossible. And you don't have any other means available to you. Now, I'd like to point out that there is a plus and minus thing going on there. What that means is that you're still going to get two answers that you'll have to do a little bit of work towards the end. And so I'll show you an example of that. And speaking of that, let's look at an example. For my first example, I want to use something that we can actually factor, so we can kind of see how this works on a simpler level. So this quadratic equation factors as x plus 5, x minus 3, meaning my two solutions are x equals negative 5 or x equals positive 3. So we know those have to be the answers, but let's apply the quadratic formula. So for good practice, I'm going to write it again. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay. A is right here, b is right there, c is right there. A, there is no a, so it's just 1. Or there's no other number, but it is just going to be 1. B is 2, and C is negative 15. That sign matters. And so now it's just about plugging those numbers into the quadratic formula. So we'll start off with negative 2, because it's a positive 2 that now becomes negative, plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4, and then use parentheses. A is 1, C is negative 15. All over 2 times 1. So half the battle with the quadratic formula is plugging it in properly. The other half is simplifying it. Excuse me. So now that we have it in here, we can work on simplifying it. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4. And then what's going to end up happening here is that these two negatives are going to cancel each other out to go plus 60. 4 times 1 times 15, all over 2. Continue to simplify. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 64. Hopefully, this is what we'll end up getting, is that 64, not a good place to draw an arrow, is a perfect square. And so I can continue to simplify to get negative 2 plus or minus 8 over 2. Now here is where we have to do some side work, if you will. Because we have the plus or minus, we're going to make two separate expressions. And keep in mind, these are solutions to x. So x equals negative 2 plus 8 over 2. So that would be what? 6 over 2, which is 3. And then we have x equals negative 2 minus 8 over 2, which would be negative 10 for that, divide by 2 to get negative 5. And so, go back up to the top, that matches the two answers we got from factoring. Now, as you can see, this is a lot of work to do if you can factor something. So to make life easier, we only use the quadratic formula when factoring is not apparent and when it's tricky. So let's do one more example. Let's take a look at this equation. F of x is equal to 6x squared plus 37x plus 35. Here, this is a guess and check kind of factoring thing. So it is perhaps not in our best interest to try to do all the guess and check, and we can just jump straight into the quadratic formula. We also have some big numbers, but we have calculators to help us out with that. So let's get to it. Negative b, so that's negative 37 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 37, minus 4 times 6 times 35. All right, looks daunting, but again, we have calculators to help us out here. All over 2 times 6. Okay, so let's crunch the numbers, see what we end up getting here. Negative 37 plus or minus the square root of 37 squared, which is 1,369, minus 4 times 6 times 35, which is 840, all over 12. Now again, the numbers look big, but take your time, use a calculator, see what you get. Negative 37 plus or minus, and we'll simplify what's underneath the radical to get 529, all over 12. Lo and behold, 529 happens to be 23 squared. So we're looking at negative 37 plus or minus 23 all over 12. And again, this is where we have to break it down into two separate expressions. So one expression will do negative 37 plus 23 over 12. And so that gets us negative 14 over 12, which is equal to negative 7 over 6, which is an acceptable answer. And then when we do the other one, negative 37 minus 23 over 12, we end up getting negative 60 over 12, which is equal to negative 5. So that's how the quadratic formula works. It can be a little painstaking at times, but it's a good way to get it is a solid way to get the right answer every time. Sometimes there are easier ways to do it. But the quadratic formula can also help out when you cannot factor something. So the final example will be when you cannot factor. Consider the quadratic equation x squared minus 2x minus 4. We can try forever to factor this. But the thing is, we cannot find factors of 4, 1 and 4, 2 and 2, that we can combine to make negative 2. Which is not going to happen. So this is where the quadratic formula comes into play. Now, we got to watch out for a couple negatives we have here. When the formula says it's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, the negative is going to cancel itself out here because of the negative with negative b. So we get 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared. This will pretty much always be a positive number because it's in parentheses and it will cancel out the negative as well. Minus 4 times 1 times 4, or negative 4, all over 2 times 1. We start to simplify that, and we'll get 2 plus or minus the square root of 4, and then this negative and this negative cancel each other out to make a positive sign, plus 16 all over 2. Now here we have to do a little simplifying of square roots, which is another reason why I have this example for us. 2 plus or minus the square root of 20 over 2. Now at this point, we have a couple of options. Option 1, use a calculator. Literally type this into your calculator twice. So you'll have 2 plus the square root of 20 over 2, and then 2 minus the square root of 20 over 2. You're going to get your answers. They're going to be awkward decimals. For example, 3.236 and negative 1.236. So you could do that. If we're trying to work with the numbers a little bit more, that's option number 2. So we go 2 plus or minus, and we've got to ask ourselves, what are some factors of 20 that we may care about? And one of those is 4, because it's a perfect square. The square of 4 is 2, so we bring the 4 outside, but as a 2. So 2 plus or minus 2 root 5 all over 2, which can get simplified because all these 2's here can be factored out as 1 plus or minus root 5. Box that, walk away. You type that into a calculator, you'll get the exact same thing. I just wanted to show you that so you could kind of get a feel for what that might look like. So, in a nutshell, this is the quadratic formula. It's all about being able to use negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, knowing where it comes from and realizing that it's a fail-safe. You could always use it. It may not be the most efficient means, but it is especially useful when factoring seems impossible or incredibly difficult. So you could just do that. And once you get good at typing it and crunching the numbers, it goes by much more quickly and makes it a little more bearable to work with.